When I met John, he was in his mid-70s. He had been a market trader and a builder. He had a large family. He was in poor health and he was lonely. And when John was younger, he'd moved away for work. And when he retired, he moved back to his hometown at the insistence of his wife. His health deteriorated and his wife left him. And it was just because John was lonely that I came to meet him when I interviewed him for my research, looking at people's pathways into loneliness. And throughout the course of my interview with John, he kept his computer open on Skype. And at the end of the interview, I asked him why. And he said he was hoping someone would come on to talk to him. As I left John's house, he took me into another room. And the room was full of unopened boxes. They were big boxes, medium boxes, and small boxes. And John told me those boxes contained gifts for family members who'd never turned up. Nevertheless, he kept ordering stuff online because the postman would come and he'd have someone to talk to. That is loneliness. Now, loneliness is not something that's exclusively experienced in later life. You know, it can happen to any one of us at any time. No one is immune. But alongside the positive things that can happen when we get older, other changes can make us vulnerable to loneliness. It's giving up work, the onset of poor health, depression, disability, cognitive impairment, moving to a new area on retirement, moving into care, becoming a carer, losing a partner or friends, or giving up driving. These are all the risk factors that can make us vulnerable. Nobody's immune. Loneliness is something I experienced myself when I was a young mum, living in a new town. I didn't really know anybody. For me, it was a feeling that only lasted a few weeks, but it had a huge impact. And on reflection, knowing what I know now, I think it probably contributed to the postnatal depression I experienced at that time. I also saw loneliness firsthand when my grandfather died. And my grandmother, despite having family around her, we visited her several times a week. She lived with my uncle and his family, and she had a brother and sister close by. She was lonely, and loneliness had a devastating effect on her. She lost interest in the things she used to enjoy. Her memory deteriorated. She stopped looking after herself and she stopped eating properly. It was only when she came to live with my mum and started to go into a day centre that she started to recover. My research explored these pathways into loneliness. And it's stories like John's that drive me, because I want to know what we can do to alleviate loneliness. And I want to know what we can do to prevent someone becoming chronically lonely, because nobody should be as lonely as John. And my research showed that people's pathways into loneliness are complex. So for some people, it might be a single event, such as a bereavement. But for other people, like John, it might be multiple reasons they become lonely. So John's journey started with his move back to his hometown. And that interrupted his friendship networks. Then his health deteriorated and his wife left him. And it was his wife leaving him that fractured his relationships with his children. Then John had to give up driving because his health was so poor. And John told me the final nail in his coffin was the news his only friend was terminally ill. John told me when he heard that news, he should have felt sorry for his friend, but in reality he felt only concerned for himself and the impact his friend's loss was going to have on him. Now, around the time I met John, I also met Brian. And the similarities in their stories is really striking. Like John, Brian came from a large family and had moved on retiring from his job as a teacher. Now, Brian told me that he and his wife had always dreamt of living in the country and walking the hills, but they found the move left them isolated. They weren't made welcome in the village. Nobody spoke to him. Then his marriage broke down and his wife left him and he became lonely. Now, when I met them both, John was chronically lonely. Brian, on the other hand, was recovering. Brian had joined social groups and gone back to university to study art. And although their pathway into loneliness was very similar, their pathway through loneliness was very different, and this led me to wonder why. Now, the obvious things are Brian was better educated, he had more money to join groups and indulge his love of art. But there was something else going on. And we know that if you're poor, so the poverty aspect, having money is really important, because we know the poorer you are, the more likely you are as you age to become lonely. But there was something else going on there, and the answer, as you might expect, was quite complicated. So my research showed that people who were lonely experienced loneliness as a disruption, and it affected how they see themselves. So John, who I spoke about earlier, told me loneliness made him feel he was no longer a person. His conversation was peppered with the stories about the person he was before he became lonely and the lonely person he was now, and he didn't recognise himself. And that sort of disruption is really important. But John's confidence, I mean, in the past, John had been quite outgoing and confident, but loneliness had shattered that confidence, and he could no longer go into a pub on his own. And that's what loneliness does to you. You can be the most confident person in the world, but loneliness, particularly over a long period of time, will knock that right out of you, and it'll make it harder for you to go back out and meet people. Brian also found his confidence had been knocked by loneliness, but he told me that in a funny way it'd been good for him as his creativity as an artist. So he was able to redefine himself in a really positive way, in a way that John couldn't. Olivia Lang, the author of The Lonely City, wrote, "The lonelier a person gets, the less adept they are at navigating the social currents." And this was certainly true of the chronically lonely people I met, certainly true of John. But that was evident in the narratives and stories of people who recovered from loneliness. So Dot, a widow, told me in the early days of her loneliness, she'd drive miles to the nearest town so she could avoid meeting people she knew. Dot did recover from loneliness, but only because she realised she needed to be with other people. Yet others didn't take that step. Jane, one of the youngest women I interviewed, was in her mid-60s. She was a very shy woman, very quiet, and she was losing her hearing. And Jane had become chronically lonely on the death of her husband. And she told me when he was alive, they'd done everything together. She had no outside interests of her own. And she reflected that this, on hindsight, had been the wrong thing to do. And this made her question a relationship she'd had with her husband, saying if she'd had outside interests and she'd had friends, she'd be better able to cope with the loneliness she now experienced. For Jane, a barrier to overcoming loneliness was a hearing impairment. She felt because she was difficult to communicate with, she couldn't go into group settings. Her shyness was another barrier. But other people who were chronically lonely also spoke about being shy or introverted. And in a sense, these personality traits laid down the roots of loneliness long before any loss. Across the life course, these were people who would never go into social groups and interact. They wouldn't seek out social interaction. For these people, loneliness had become a self-perpetuating cycle, and social groups were now something to be feared. My research also showed that people who are loneliness brings people face to face with the reality of the relationships with those around them, with their family, their friends, and their neighbours. Now, some people had family and friends who responded in the way you'd hoped they would. Others found that the events that triggered loneliness damaged their relationships. Other people found their family and friends couldn't support them in the way they'd hoped. And we shouldn't judge people for that, because not everyone copes easily with the things that life throws at us. And some people, of course, had no social connections at all, no family, no friends. So Val, a retired health professional, told me that she became chronically lonely on the death of her husband. Prior to his death, she had a large social network, she had a busy social life, and she had a close relationship with her children. But since his death, her relationships hadn't lived up to their expectations. Her daughter wasn't interested in her mother's loneliness, she was busy with her own life. And Val told me that she didn't want to put on her because her daughter was hurting too. She didn't want to add to that burden. Val's friends would still take her out and about, but Val was losing her sight. And they'd forget that Val could no longer do the things that they could do. And one friend in particular would take Val shopping and wander off in Marks and Spencer's and leave her stranded in the aisles. And for Val, reinforced the loneliness she felt. Tom was another older adult that I interviewed. He had family around him who visited him regularly, and he had a large circle of friends who were supportive and made sure he was part of all their social activities. You wouldn't think Tom would be chronically lonely, but he was, because Tom couldn't get past the loss of his wife. She'd been the linchpin of their social activities, and he could no longer get past the fact that she was no longer there to be part of them. While Kate, one of the oldest women I interviewed, was one of the growing number of older adults aging without children. Kate had no family left of her own, having lost her husband and her sister. The only family she had were a niece of her husband's who'd lived miles away. Kate would go days without speaking to another person, and she struggled to get over the loss of her husband. And she still spoke to him on a daily basis, even though he was no longer there. Kate had friends, and she still went out and about. But she said her new friends weren't like the friends she'd lost. There was some vital quality missing from those relationships. And in a sense, the chronically lonely individuals I interviewed had become overwhelmed by the events that triggered loneliness. They felt powerless to change their circumstances. Each new knockback reinforced the loneliness they felt, so it became a self-perpetuating cycle. And this was reflected in how they managed loneliness on a day-to-day basis, because most saw only barriers to alleviating loneliness and anticipated it worsening over time. So the people who recovered from loneliness were those who went back to social activities they'd been part of in the past. They joined new activity groups. Some took up new hobbies. But those who were chronically lonely, they focused their attention on solitary activities. They read, they watched TV, they did gardening. Some people turned to alcohol to numb the pain. My research also showed that some people will always find their own solutions to alleviate loneliness. Others will turn to interventions such as befriending, tea parties, men's sheds. But the chronically lonely may need more than befriending. The chronically lonely may need support to overcome their negative mindset. They may need support to overcome the grief and depression they might be experiencing. They need support to develop the confidence to go back out into the social world. They need to feel that they have a value and that they have something to offer. And they need the opportunity to do something with, as opposed to having something done to them. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's been argued that loneliness is an evolutionary mechanism designed to protect us from the harmful effects that not having social connections can have on our physical and mental health. Human beings, like apes, are designed to live in social groups. We need to belong and be part of the group. So why are we so ashamed to talk about our need for other people? Loneliness doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It doesn't mean you have no one who cares for you. It just means that due to a set of circumstances, events, or just life in general, your connections are not as meaningful as you'd like or as plentiful as you'd like. And we all need to be brave like the people I interviewed who opened up and spoke about their experiences. So what did I learn from them? I learned that we need to reduce the stigma around loneliness so people can share their experience and talk about it. I learned that a one-size-fits-all approach to alleviating loneliness is never going to work. We need personalised responses. And I've learned that small acts of kindness can make a big difference to someone who's lonely. And it can be the difference between them recovering from loneliness or ending up like John, waiting for the postman.